I hadn't planned to stay long at the house I once called home, yet grief has a strange way of dragging you back into old rooms filled with echoes, and as I stood in the hallway where my marriage had slowly died, the scent of polish and jasmine pulled memories from places I thought I'd sealed forever. My ex-wife's laughter from another life, the arguments that followed, and the silence that ended everything, but it was her mother, Marianne, who unsettled me most, watching from the kitchen doorway. With that unreadable expression she'd perfected over years of observing people without revealing herself. A woman who had always walked the thin line between kindness and something sharper, something that made you second-guess your footing. She moved closer as relatives murmured around us, her heels soft against the tile, her perfume familiar yet newly dangerous, and when she leaned in and whispered, "Wanna look?" with a smirk that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing, my body locked in place, not because of desire but because of confusion, because this was the woman who had once lectured me about responsibility and loyalty, who had held my hands at the wedding and cried, and now her eyes held a challenge, as if she were testing whether the broken man in front of her still had a pulse. And in that frozen moment the house seemed to tilt, the past colliding with a present I didn't recognize, my heart pounding as questions raced through my mind. What look, what game, and why? Now, while she straightened up as if nothing had happened, leaving me standing there with a silence louder than any argument I'd ever had with her daughter. And as I followed her with my eyes down the hall, I realized the most dangerous things aren't always shouted. Sometimes they're whispered. And if you've ever felt your entire sense of right and wrong wobble in a single second, you'll understand why that smirk haunted me long after she disappeared into the next room. Because it wasn't flirtation alone, it was a mirror held up to my loneliness, my failure, and the parts of myself I was afraid to admit were still alive. And if this story already has you leaning closer, wondering where a single whisper can lead, make sure you subscribe because this is only the beginning. Days passed but that moment refused to fade, replaying itself in quiet hours like a song you can't turn off. And when Marian called asking if I could help clear the garage before the house was sold, I told myself I agreed out of obligation, not curiosity. Yet the moment I stepped back inside, the tension returned, thicker now, charged by unspoken words and the absence of her daughter. And as we worked side by side, dust floating in late afternoon light, she spoke with a softness that felt intentional, reflecting on mistakes, on marriages that fail not because of betrayal but because people stop seeing each other. And when she paused, meeting my eyes, there was no smirk this time, only honesty, the kind that strips defenses away, and she admitted she'd watched me fade during the divorce, watched me carry guilt I didn't earn, and that whisper from before hadn't been an invitation to cross a line but a test to see if I still recognized myself. And in that confession the tension shifted, becoming something heavier, something human, and I realized how easily stories can twist when silence fills the gaps. How temptation isn't always about desire but about being seen when you feel invisible. And as I left the house for the final time, sunlight breaking through clouds, I understood that freezing in that hallway had saved me. Not from her, but from losing myself, because some moments are designed to reveal who you are, not change you. And if you've ever stood at a crossroads between loneliness and integrity, you know how powerful that choice can be. And if this story made you feel that pause, that internal struggle, then subscribe to the channel, because these are the stories that stay with you long after the video ends. And the next one might hit even closer to home, that I told myself the unease would fade once the house was emptied. Yet weeks later I still found myself thinking about Marianne's words, not because of what they hinted at but because of what they revealed about how closely she'd been watching me all those years. And when she invited me for coffee as thanks, I nearly declined, knowing how easily moments can slip when emotions are raw. But something inside me wanted closure, clarity, a way to put that whisper to rest. And sitting across from her in a quiet cafe, I saw her not as my ex-wife's mother or a provocation but as a woman who had lived through disappointments of her own, her voice steady as she spoke about regret, about the loneliness that creeps in when roles end and identities dissolve, and when she apologized, not for the whisper but for the weight it placed on me. I felt something release in my chest, realizing that the most dangerous misunderstandings are born when people project their pain onto silence. And as we parted with a respectful distance, I understood that the real tension wasn't between us, but within me, between who I had been and who I was becoming. And if this chapter made you feel that subtle shift, that emotional tightening before something breaks or heals, don't forget to subscribe, because the story is about to turn inward in ways you might not expect. The call from my ex-wife came late at night, the kind that instantly raises your pulse, and when she asked if I'd been seeing her mother, accusation sharp beneath restraint, I realized how fragile truths become when passed through hurt, and as I explained everything, the house, the coffee, the misunderstanding, I heard the exhaustion in her silence, the shared recognition that our divorce had left wreckage far beyond the two of us, and she admitted she'd always sensed an unspoken tension between her mother and the world, a tendency to test people instead of trusting them, and in that moment I saw how easily cycles repeat, how whispers turn into wounds when left unexplained, and when we hung up, something settled between us, not reconciliation but respect, a mutual understanding that we had survived something difficult without becoming cruel. And if you've ever felt that quiet relief when a hard conversation finally happens, you know how powerful it can be, and this is why stories like this matter, so subscribe, because the next chapter is where everything finally finds its meaning. Months later, as I walked past the old neighborhood without stopping, I realized the house no longer pulled at me. The memories softened, no longer sharp enough to cut, and Marianne's whisper had transformed in my mind from temptation into a turning point. A moment that forced me to confront how easily loneliness can masquerade as desire, and how strength sometimes looks like stillness, like freezing instead of acting. And as I began rebuilding my life, new routines, new connections, a renewed sense of self, I understood that not every provocative moment is meant to be pursued. Some are meant to wake you up, to remind you that integrity isn't loud or dramatic, it's quiet and firm. And if this story made you reflect on your own crossroads, the moments that could have changed everything but didn't, then subscribe to the channel, because these aren't just stories. They're mirrors, and the next one might show you something about yourself you didn't know you needed to see. Life has a way of testing lessons after you think you've learned them, and just when I felt settled, when routines stopped feeling temporary and mornings didn't ache anymore, I ran into Marianne again at a charity event neither of us expected the other to attend. And for a moment that old tension flickered between us like a spark that never quite became fire. But this time there was no smirk, no whisper, only a calm acknowledgement, two people aware of a past moment that no longer held power. And as we spoke, briefly, about ordinary things, the weather, mutual acquaintances, the strange comfort of time passing, I realized how much I had changed, how the man who once froze in a hallway now stood firmly in himself, able to be polite without being pulled, kind without being confused, and when she wished me well, genuinely, I felt gratitude instead of conflict, understanding that growth doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it shows up in how little something affects you anymore. And if this chapter resonates with you, if you've ever noticed how a situation that once shook you now barely stirs your calm, then subscribe, because this journey is about becoming unshakable. Looking back, that whispered moment became a dividing line in my life, a quiet before and after that taught me more than the collapse of my marriage ever did, because it showed me that temptation isn't always about crossing boundaries. Sometimes it's about recognizing them, respecting them, and choosing yourself over impulse. And as I moved forward, open to love again but no longer desperate for validation, I understood that freezing wasn't weakness, it was instinct protecting something valuable. And if you're listening to this story wondering what you would have done in that hallway, know this. The strongest choices are often invisible to others but unforgettable to you. And if this story made you pause, reflect, or feel seen in your own quiet struggles, then subscribe to the channel because more stories like this are coming. Stories about moments that don't make headlines but change lives. Time didn't rush after everything settled. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, as if life itself wanted to make sure I understood the lesson before moving me forward. And in that quiet stretch I began to notice how many moments shape us without ever announcing their importance. How a single whisper in a hallway had redirected my entire sense of self. Not by what it offered but by what it forced me to confront, and as I rebuilt, piece by piece, habit by habit, I stopped defining my strength by what I could endure and started defining it by what I could refuse, the lines I could hold even when no one was watching. And one evening, sitting alone with the city lights flickering like distant thoughts, I realized I no longer replayed the smirk or the words themselves, but the stillness that followed, the moment I chose not to move, not to lean in, not to let loneliness decide for me, and that stillness had become a foundation, shaping how I spoke, how I loved, how I forgave myself, because the truth is, Some chapters of our lives don't end with drama or romance or revenge. They end with clarity, with a quiet understanding that you survived something that could have changed you for the worse but didn't. And as new people entered my life, they met a man who knew his boundaries, who valued being seen without being tempted, and who understood that dignity isn't something you prove to others, it's something you protect within yourself. And if you're listening to this story wondering whether small moments really matter, whether a single decision can echo for years, let this be your answer, because it can. And if this chapter felt personal, if it made you pause and think about your own crossroads, then subscribe to the channel, because these stories aren't just told to entertain. They're told to remind you that sometimes the strongest move you'll ever make is standing perfectly still.